24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This is Salam Radio.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. This is Salam Radio. We are back for our weekly show, Why Politics Matters, here on 106.2 FM. And I'm ably joined again with my co-host, Alex Blur. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hello and good evening once again.
Really good to be back. Really good first show. Some excellent feedback. Lots and lots of people engage with this show, and that's fantastic. We hope it continues today. Today's show is called Left versus Right. Brackets and centre, close brackets, because there is, as you know, very many different ways of classifying how somebody sits on a particular political spectrum. So, introduce the show. Talk to me about left versus right. What are the different areas that we might be exploring in the next hour?
Right, so it's quite a wide area, isn't it? And I think some people might be surprised where they actually stand with regards to the whole left versus right spectrum. What I would say, first of all, to you users, viewers, listeners, is have a look at the political compass test, which is available to you online. And I'd ask everybody to work their way through this and maybe surprise themselves at some of the places where they lie in respect to leaders, parties, etc., which currently reside on the political landscape in UK society. But I think it's important that we go right back to the beginning and just understand where this term of left and right comes from.
Yeah, so the history of it, but also the fact that it's multifaceted, isn't it? Like, if I see you, I might just say you're a lefty.
Yeah.
But would you say you've got some views in some areas of politics that don't necessarily sit with your typical lefty?
Quite possibly so.
Okay, you've not found those yet, though.
I struggle to think of what they might be right off the top of my head.
Okay.
But again, it's quite hard to just put things on a firm left and right. And let's start right back at the beginning. So, during the French Revolution, those who sided with the king and wanted the feudal system to carry on were placed on the right. Those who were against it and wanted progression, or let's not even call it progression, but for society to evolve, to change, were put on the left. And we can very much translate that into modern contemporary society today. Conservatism is traditionally held on the right, and what that stands for is maintaining the status quo for traditional social, political and family values.
Yep.
And the country patriotism and a belief in military expenditure, protection of borders, etc. So it's all kind of tying into that understanding of what people understand of conservative politics. Traditionally, Labour have sat on the left, and I say traditionally because there's a lot of arguments now which would suggest that they are a little bit more right of centre, but because their social policies are a lot more around society, welfare, people's well-being, as opposed to the state and corporations, they traditionally sit more on the left.
You're making it sound like, this might not be intentional, but you're making it sound like if you care for people, you're on the left. And if you don't care for anyone, you're on the right. Is that... It's very simplistic, I know.
It is. And I hate to say that people on the right actually just don't care for people, full stop. I think that's a very blanket statement to make. I think really what it comes down to is that on the right, it's not so much that they don't believe that people shouldn't have healthcare or good education, but more so much that if you are going to have these things, people should be paying for them themselves.
Okay. I've heard the terms both left and right used in a complimentary way and also in a derogatory way. You know, you'll see someone, you say, oh, he's proper right wing, and that's not a good thing, or he's proper left wing, and that's not a good thing, and vice versa. So it's almost like labels, but when we use these labels, we're probably talking more about their position relative to others, or maybe even relative to you, the person who's speaking.
Yeah, or maybe even just relative to what's being spoken about in society as a whole. You see, how we view this perception of left and right, we view it through what is known as the Overton window.
Okay. Now, so very interesting concept, this.
Well, what the Overton window is, it's basically the perception of what is allowed to be aired and received in society. So a lot of this will come from what's perpetuated in the media and the narratives of the day. If we have to have a look at the 2019, I think we mentioned this at the last one, and I hate to go on about it again, but the 2019 election where we had Labour with what was being described in the media as being a very, very left-wing manifesto.
Yep.
However, if we were to open that up, now, yes, within the UK's Overton window, things like free broadband, like he was suggesting, the renationalisation of infrastructure, these all sound like very, very left-wing policies.
They sound like crazy ideas.
In the UK, they do, yes.
They sound crazy.
Because we live in a very a corporate-driven society. The narratives come from the media, and the media is reliant upon advertisers for much of its funding. So obviously what it's going to be supportive of is what its advertisers are supportive of. It's not going to be publishing stories which go against the perspectives its advertisers need to make money and shareholder dividends. So what we end up with is very pro-capitalist policies being published, and anything which seems like it might be against people's free right to make money in any way they seem fit, regardless of who oppresses or subjugates, as being slightly left. Now, if we were to take those same policies that Labour ran for in 2019 and have a look at, say, the northern European countries around Sweden, Denmark, etc., what we see actually is that a lot of those policies that were labelled as being very far left in the UK are actually just left of centre.
Okay, so we're definitely going to explore the Overton window. That's what it's called, isn't it? The Overton window.
Correct.
Because that kind of shapes where you're allowed to discuss politics, and anything outside of that is way too radical. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Before we carry on, I do want to encourage all of our listeners to get involved. If there's anything that you want us to talk about, if you want to ask us a question, or if you want to just give a contribution on where you think you sit, left versus right. Are you a lefty? Are you right winger? Are you lefty and you've got some some interesting thoughts on why that might be so. If you're right wing, but you want to tell us about all the positives, then absolutely feel free to ring in. Give us a call on 01733 602 133. That's 01733 602 133. We're also live on Facebook, so do give us any of your comments or questions on Facebook, and we'll try to pick them up. So, Alex, you mentioned the Overton window. So some of our listeners might know what that is. But the Overton window, essentially, that's like a playing space that the media have determined, and anything within that playing space is okay. Anything outside of that is considered to be radical. Like you said, free broadband, that was a radical idea. So how do you shift the Overton window to move it across to areas where I might be more comfortable with some of the policy that's coming out?
Okay, it's a really good question, and there's a couple of examples that we might be able to draw on which we can show to people as applications where they have actually seen the Overton window shift.
Okay.
So again, the Overton window, as we say, is that realm where you're allowed to discuss things and what's being voiced. In 2017, The Guardian done a several-page spread on the politics of Ukraine at the time.
Okay.
A lot of what it discussed was some of the far-right influences, particularly, I'm sure many people will have heard of this, the Azov Battalion, which was a battalion within the Ukraine Armed Forces which are extremely right-wing and have a lot of links to real Nazism and fascism. And when I say links, we're talking swastika tattoos,
okay,
and symbolism attained to the SS Brigade.
Wow.
Now, that was just in 2017. However, now, here we are, we're friends of Ukraine, apparently. We're supporting Ukraine. And I'm not... And if you were to say anything else that was anti-Ukraine resentment now, or to bring these subjects up, the narrative is that you're pro-Russian suddenly. And this kind of gets back to something we touched on last week about the binary arguments which surround things. Just by saying that you don't agree with one thing certainly does not mean that suddenly you're on the agreement side of another.
So just saying that's reminded me of George W. Bush, when he says you're either with us or against us in this fight against terrorism and fight for freedom back in the Iraq war days. And you're right, it's very binary, isn't it? It's us versus them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so one of the key ways of moving this Overton window is to create an enemy for people, create a common enemy. And by doing that, what you do is you control the conversation around that.
Okay. That sounds like almost a negative way in which to move the Overton window. Okay, you're making people hate something, and as a result, you're pulling things towards
Absolutely.
your own.
That's how we've seen it done in the UK. Yeah, I mean, I think I know where you're going with this. And
as in, like, there should be a
negative.
positive. There should be an equivalent positive way in which to move it. So, for example, I know I'm familiar with think tanks that operate in and around Westminster.
Tefton Street, for example.
There we go, yeah. And what they will do is they'll espouse some crazy policy ideas, and they'll take a full page spread in the Times and regarding the EFT and all that kind of stuff. And the conversation would be like, oh my God, look how crazy these people are. But they're talking about it. These things are being discussed, even though they're deemed to be crazy. And what that does is that makes people a little bit more susceptible to similar ideas, but not as extreme.
Sure.
So, for example, we absolutely can't privatize the NHS. That's something that we abhor, right? But then the idea, so we'll say, oh, we need to privatize the NHS because it's super inefficient, and the whole country will go mad. And you say, okay, well, let's not privatize the NHS. But look, there's a few areas where we don't have enough GPs servicing their residents. So how about we bring in a health company that's going to allow you to see your GP sooner? And that's going to be outside of the NHS just because we've got a shortage. And people are like, well, that doesn't sound like crazy, right? That means I'll get to see my GP. And that's like privatization by stealth.
Sure.
But they reject the crazy idea, but then willing to accept something that almost feels like a compromise.
Yeah, and there's no questioning of it, is there, in the media?
Yeah, none whatsoever, because the media should be able to identify that.
Again.
They should be able to identify the trap that the public are falling in, and they should be flagging it.
And no doubt they can. They're certainly in the best position to do so. However, we touched on this previously, and there's one thing stopping them doing that. We cannot have a fair media as long as the media is answerable to the corporate entities that pay their bills.
So we'll come back to me. I just want to read this comment out by Faisal. I had a quick read of it while we were talking, and I just want to read it out. It said, generally, British society and its systems is mainly capitalist, which is why people don't support those views. Also, nationalisation doesn't work here because people working in the nationalised organisations think about themselves and their jobs and don't bother with saving money, which is why I think money is wasted. So Faisal Mahmood basically he's coming out with the, I don't want to say age old because I don't want to belittle it. I think it's a valid point, but it's that usual criticism, isn't it, around nationalisation and lack of efficiency in publicly run organisations and publicly run companies. And I know we've got a full show on that coming up.
Yeah.
But this is where people's thinking is right now. So the Overton window that we're talking about, that's got people thinking, do you know what? Nationalisation, theoretically, it's good. Yeah, we understand these are profit-making entities, and other people are making profits from different things that we run in this country. But if we were to nationalise, then we'd lack efficiency.
It's certainly an argument that I've heard a number of times.
Do you think
However, I'm yet to see any data I feel that actually supports it. And I think what we've got here is actually an example of how the media is manipulating that Overton window. Now, we talk about waste. If we've got a train service, for example, let's talk trains.
Trains, I can understand
Perfect
trains.
example, okay? So
They take a lot of money, my money every month. So yeah, let's talk about trains.
And there are people that have been striking recently. It's also a part of infrastructure which used to be publicly owned and has been nationalised. So it's been taken out of the realm where Faisal has suggested where there is more waste, and it's been put into, by premise, the area where there should be less waste.
Yes.
However, what we have is we have a service that now doesn't run on time. We have less trains running than what there were before, and we have CEOs and shareholders taking absolutely millions and millions out of the industry, to the point where actually a lot of our rail industry is run by the German government
And the French government.
to support their GDPs. So if you want to talk about waste, we're talking about the trains here. The amount of money which is actually being taken out of the UK economy, which should be being put back into the UK economy, and it's being done so at the cost of rail travellers, their ticket prices, to subsidise the welfare and easier lives of people overseas.
Brilliant.
There's your waste.
Yeah, so Barry Gardner, MP, came to Peterborough a few weeks back.
Yeah.
And he said, we want to nationalise our utilities and our railways. Actually, no, we don't want to nationalise them. They're already nationalised. They're currently owned by the French and German governments.
Yeah.
And if you look at the shareholders of electricity, gas, railways, telecoms, things like Vodafone, British Telecom, and even the Royal Mail, massive shareholders of these organisations are the German Central Pension Fund. They've got lots and lots of money, and they invest in these companies because they know they make a profit, and they'll take the dividends, and they'll use the dividends to pay the pension of German pensioners. Oh, nothing against German pensioners or French pensioners, but it's companies that are being run here in the UK and enriching essentially pensioners abroad because their governments had the foresight to invest in these industries.
Absolutely. Why are we not running them for the well-being of our own citizens and for the service that they can provide them?
Yeah. And then the other thing I'd say, Faisal, and genuinely I appreciate your comment because these are great talking points. But the other thing I'd say, Faisal, is I'm sure you've travelled around Europe and you've been on trains run by French government and German governments. The Japanese train system is one of the best in the world. It's all run by the government. These trains are super fast. Like, the infrastructure is incredible. They're on time to the minute pretty much every single time. And the cost of a rail fare per 100 miles is a fraction of what we pay here in the UK. So what's going wrong in the UK? You can't say if we nationalise these industries, we'll have inefficiencies. That's almost saying we're always going to be rubbish, whether we're private or public. But there are examples around the world where it has been nationalised and it's running in a much better way than ours are.
Absolutely. And just saying that we have to go back to the way that things were done before in a society that has moved on isn't either, I don't think, what anybody is arguing. We can get that workforce invested in the places where they work, and if you are there and you're looking at having an investment in the business that you're working in, then you're going to be interested in cutting down on waste anyway. You're going to be interested in increasing the efficiency. And again, if we go back and we have a look at some of the ideas that other countries have had a look at in this, back in the 70s in Sweden, where things were even further left as far as the Overton window there is what it is today, they were talking about policies which would, each year, a corporation had to put a certain amount of its profits to one side to buy its workforce shares in the company they were working in.
So that's what's like a cooperative ownership model,
Yeah. And what it would do over time is, if unchecked, would increase the amount of public ownership or the amount of workforce ownership in each company, therefore reducing the wealth gap within the society itself.
Yeah, better distribution of wealth.
Yeah.
I've had a few more comments in. Mike Kennard's watching. Mike,
Evening, Mike.
Welcome to the show. Hope you enjoy what you're watching so far. Faisal's come back and said that's not too different, allowing private software companies provide solutions to the NHS rather than trying to develop everything in-house. That's basically saying you're outsourcing some of the software work from the NHS, and that's, again, privatisation by stealth. Iram Shah tuning in for the first time. Hi, guys. Hi, Iram. Thank you for tuning in. Before you go, you need to let us know, are you left-wing or right-wing, and what does that mean to you? I'd be interested to know. Faisal, I'd be very interested to know where you think you sit on the political spectrum. Are you a lefty? Are you a righty? And what it is specifically that you think describes you as that. Faisal's come back and also said, were the trains better when they were nationalised in the past?
Well, I'm maybe a little bit too young to be the best person to answer this.
Same.
So all I can advise is the discourse that I hear. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest and just answer one of the questions that you put up there. Am I left wing or right wing? For myself, I'm certainly left.
Tell me. You're left. Okay.
I am left wing, and I'm a very proud left wing. And I do organise and speak with a lot of other left wingers, some union members, etc. So my answer here might be a little bit biased because it is going to be based on the anecdotes that I hear, and of course, just like the Overton window, in my life, the views that I hear are sometimes limited and prejudiced because of those of the people in my network and people I hang around with.
Absolutely, yeah.
But what I do hear is that the don't anymore, that there used to be more services and that there isn't. And if I look at my local area, I do know that as before my area in the time, you used to be able to get a train to Skegness, you used to be able to get a train to Huntingdon, to Hunstanton, sorry. Popular spots for people of Peterborough that now are unable to get there.
Nice day out of the beach, yeah.
And the important thing is that the people who actually are more affected by these lack of services, of course, are those on the lower economic ends, are the more vulnerable. It's working class people now who can't get to Hunstanton, whilst the middle classes will still go there by train.
I'm going to pull this back a little bit. I've a comment from Mike, which I'll come to in a second. But I just want to pull it back a little bit. So you started off by saying, I would consider myself to be left-wing, and I surround myself with people who are left-wing. you're in a bit of a, your Overton window is a little bit more left than your average media consuming resident of Peterborough.
Yeah.
But we really need to make this distinction here, don't we? Like, just because you're left wing doesn't mean you're saying things because you're left wing. It's the other way round. You feel this is what I think is, because people, like, you might say something, I might say something, I might say universal basic income for everyone. That's my belief. And they'll say, well, you're only saying that because you're left wing. And I'm like, no, I'm only left wing because I'm saying that. And I'm saying that because I believe it, because I think it's the right thing to do. So we need to be really, really careful, particularly when it comes to labeling people. Don't discount what somebody's saying just because you because it's not like supporting football teams.
It's not. No.
Don't think he's only saying Anthony Martial's a brilliant striker because he supports Man United. Because this isn't football. This is politics. This is real life. This affects people. So you can't just have that view.
And things are usually not that binary either. What might be good for one part of society might be negative for another. So, like you say, it's really important to understand where you stand when you're making these labels in the first place.
Yes, yeah. I just don't want, like, I mean, if for example Faisal says, "Oh, I'm right wing," and then I read something that he says, I don't want to then say, "Oh, of course you're going to say that because you are right wing."
And you're right. I mean, that seems to be the way it gets played in the media, with the tribalism and left versus right, so to speak. However, you mentioned earlier about centrism.
Yeah.
And this group in the area, there's a lot of data to suggest that those that are in the centre are actually less politically educated than those that do claim to be left or right. There was I can't remember who made the quote, but somebody actually, there's a quote which says the centre is a refuge for the ignorant and the apathetic.
That's what I was going to say. It's a lazy position to take.
Yeah.
And being a little bit more extreme in your view requires a bit of effort to try and understand the
correct.
Yeah, the
and
issues.
when you start seeing how things are interconnected, you start getting drawn into one side or the other. So what I would argue is that if you're somebody that is a landlord, if you get a transient income, if you take money from shareholder dividends, etc.
Sure.
Well, your interests are going to be very much in protecting these incomes, protecting your interests. And so chances are you're going to align a lot more with neoliberalism and conservative politics and ideologies.
And looking after yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
However, if you work in the community, if your concerns are the homeless person that you see each day, if your concerns are around people being oppressed, getting a voice, or inequality, then you're going to have a look at what these aspects are which affect the things which are in your interest realm.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm going to read out a few of these comments. Thank you so much to everyone who's contributing to the show. We are heading into a break shortly, but I'm going to try getting through these before we get to that. Mike Kennard says the nationalised industries had a different accounting system and finance basis from private industry. They had to borrow through government bonds while private companies borrow in a competitive financial market in order to invest. They actually contributed to public funds through making a surplus. They weren't allowed to call it profit. So it was surplus rather than profit.
Yeah.
Faisal says, I think utilities and those things which benefit the community should be managed by the government and not run for profit. That's... Yeah, you're not going to see me disagree with that. However, specialist skills should be outsourced rather than trying to create everything in-house.
And I'd agree with that as well, Faisal. And I'll just come back to your last point, which you made about outsourcing of IT programming, etc.
That was a good example, I thought.
It really was, yeah. And even myself, who does agree or believe in a fully publicly owned and managed NHS, you're quite right. The NHS needs to be interested in healthcare.
Yes.
And the things which interconnect with it, whether that's food security or secure living, etc. It doesn't need to be writing programs, and no, we should be outsourcing things. There needs to be a certain level of technocracy involved in leadership as well, where we actually do bring in the best people for the jobs.
Yeah, and I agree with that as well. Mike's just come back and said, P.S. opinion polls show that the majority of people in this country are in favour of nationalisation. It would be interesting to know whether being in favour of nationalisation for the majority of the people in this country implies Britain is a left-leaning country, because that's what it would mean, right? Councillor Nicola Day, she's made a comment. Hi, Councillor Nicola. Thank you so much for your contribution. She says the Green Party often say that they are not left or right, but straight ahead, focusing on the future of the planet in terms of social and environmental policies. Some elements of the green policy overlap with conservatism in terms of protecting nature. However, our policies are often more left in terms of social and environmental policies than Labour. Organisations like XR, Extinction Rebellion, have shifted the Overton window, whether or not you agree with their tactics, as they have occupied space in the media, highlighting the frightening issue of climate crisis. That's an excellent post, Councillor Day. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
We are heading into the break, and that first half hour has flown by, and we've not even identified some of the different strands that you would want to investigate to see whether or not you are left or right. So we do have the second half of the show to do that, but just very, very quickly, 20 seconds, thoughts on what Councillor Days had to say about the Overton window shifting by XR's tactics.
And absolutely so. XR tactics, whatever you think of them, what they have done is they've perpetuated a conversation into a realm and a space where it wasn't happening already. And that's exactly how we were speaking about how the media does shift the Overton window when it wants to meet its needs.
Yes.
So XR have actually managed to mobilise, take that power away from its traditional source, and change the Overton window. Brilliant stuff.
Amazing. Okay, well, we're going to go into a break now. There's going to be 4 minutes of adverts, and we're going to be back where we try and pin down exactly how far left Alex Blower really is. Join us again in about 4 minutes.
You're listening to Salam Radio, and it's now time for Isha Azan. This Azan is sponsored by Park Foods. Come and see the difference.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته اللهم آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم بك نحيا وبك نموت وإليك المصير. رضينا بالله ربا وبالإسلام دينا وبمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم نبيا ورسولا.
In the heart of Cambridgeshire, this is Salam Radio.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Why Politics Matter here on 106.2 FM. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I'm in the studio here with Alex Blair. We've had some really interesting discussion and debate and some fantastic comments from our listeners in the first half of the show. And I think we really should just dive in to this spectrum that is left versus right. We talked a little bit about the history.
Yeah.
We talked about the French Revolution. And we talked about how it was an organizational thing. They were counting up how many people were for the monarchy versus against the monarchy. And to make it easier to count, they pushed people to the right side and to the left side. And it was easier for them to count rather than grouping them by some kind of political ideology. And it sounds like it was just just almost like a one question test on whether you're right or left. And after that, it became adopted. But where do our current political parties here in the UK sit on that spectrum, in your view, and maybe give us some justification of why you think so?
And this is certainly something I feel has changed over time. I mean, traditionally, I think, as we mentioned, we would view Labour as being on the left and the Conservatives as being on the right.
Yeah, that's the traditional view, yes.
However, 2019, certainly on the Labour side of that, brought them under Keir Starmer much further to the right. We saw a party that used to take its funding from its membership link onto a more corporate-driven donor model.
Okay.
We have seen them talk against workers' rights and even advise their Labour MPs not to speak in favour of £15 an hour for workers.
So you're talking workers' rights. Workers' rights is something where you think they've shifted away from workers'
Absolutely,
rights.
yeah. And likewise for their support of unions. We have seen Keir Starmer advise against his MPs, although not all of them have followed his advice or his rhetoric, as not supporting picket lines and unions. And this is something that traditional Labour would have been. And it's also something that I'm just going to jump up and challenge Nicola Day's premise, I should say, about the Green Party being more centre. And I would actually say that currently they're more left than Labour, if only because in their...
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think Councillor Day said they were centre. I think she was saying...
Am I misquoting? I do apologise, Nicola.
Yeah, she said we're not left, we're not right, we're straight ahead. Basically what she's saying is we don't faff around with labels. Sure. We're just thinking about the future. I think it's kind of what she meant. Correct me if I'm wrong, Councillor Day, but that's what I felt she meant. But yeah, she's just saying, look, we're just straight down the line. We're straight ahead. We are what you see we are, and we're going to tell it like it is, kind of thing. But you're right. I think there's some aspects of policy where they're definitely taking the traditional Labour ground on some policies. Workers' rights, for example. Picket lines, for example. The right to protest, for example.
And so far, they're the only party I'm aware of that has got union support and working alongside the unions actually wrote into its current party's charter.
Okay. So you'd say of the... And we'll just talk about the four main parties then, shall we?
Yeah.
The Greens, the Lib Dems, Labour and Conservative. So you think the Greens are the furthest left on the spectrum?
I would actually say currently they're the only party that, looking at the national doctrine, is even left of centre in the UK currently.
Right, so you think there's a set on... So, and this is your view.
Sure,
I think this is your
and
view.
please challenge it by all means.
So your view is there's right of politics, left of politics, and then there's a centre. And your view of where centre is currently to the left of where Labour, Lib Dem and Conservatives are.
Yes.
And the Greens are the only party that is left of what your view of what centre ground is.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the interesting one for me then is Lib Dems and Labour. Where do you put them? Do you put Labour comes next and then Lib Dems and then the Tories, or do you have it the other way around? Because I really don't know. I'm only familiar with local Lib Dem councillors, and they seem fairly left in some aspects.
I'd agree.
Possibly a little bit right in others.
And traditionally, the Liberal Democrats were, they're against authoritarian. They've got a lot going for self-determination.
Yeah.
But since Brexit, I would suggest that maybe they have taken, nationally at least, a little bit more of a step to the right. And that's probably indicative of where that Overton window lies, as it has been shifting to the right. Parties vying for power are having to fit in with that Overton window. It's all very nice having really liberal policies, but if they're not popular, or if the Overton window doesn't allow them to be spoken about, what's really on your question is what will people vote for, whether it's good, whether it's bad.
Yeah, so I mean, they just check what you think about this then. So if the Lib Dems, they like to be known as the centre party, right?
Yeah.
They like to be known as the party in between Labour and the Tories, and they're going to be sensible on things. They're not going to be extreme on things, and they'll take like some kind of a pragmatic approach to different policy ideas. But if the Overton window shifts, then they almost by necessity have to shift with it. Otherwise, they get left out of the Overton window, and so it's almost like it's transient, isn't it? It's quite dynamic what particular parties might put out there and say this is what we stand behind.
Yes, it is, and it will shift again by being pulled by the media. And this is, I think, where it actually goes back to a little bit about what we spoke about last week about accountability.
Yeah,
because it's not the politician's job, in my view anyway, and if we're going to be calling ourselves a democratic country, to simply give what the media is suggesting it should.
No, absolutely not. You have to speak your mind, right?
And they need to challenge this, don't they? However, and again, we mentioned this last week.
Do you
as
think
well.
this show sits outside the British media's Overton window?
I think.
I hope so.
But yeah,
I hope so.
I think it does, and certainly. I like to think that what we are trying to do here is shift that Overton window a little bit, not to the left or to the right, but just widening it
expand
up
it, yeah,
and expand it, yeah, because we shouldn't have such a narrow view. That's what makes everything so binary.
Mike's come in with a couple of comments. The first one is Lib Dems were part of the Cameron government, so they've obviously aligned themselves to the right,
to conservative values, to neoliberal ideals, and again, when you surround yourself with ideologies, they do affect you in some way. So, no, good point, and that's probably part of the reason as well that has pulled them further to the right.
Yeah, and then the other thing Mike says is around just the Labour Party's view on workers' rights. Official Labour policy has a lot about ending the gig economy and zero-hours contracts, trade union access, and repealing of anti-union laws. Against that, you have Keir Starmer's position on picket lines, which was rejected by quite a few of the shadow cabinet. So
that brings up another question, doesn't it? Because within these parties, there's also a variation of how far their members are left and how far their members are right. Just because somebody is in a party, it doesn't mean that necessarily they're going to align with that same Overton window position as what the main party's policies are.
Yep.
I mean, if you have a look at the Labour Party, for example, you've certainly got that wide range of your more corporate bodies, such as Keir Starmer, and then your more social-minded people such as Shamina Begum or Shamina Begum, who are a lot more into the interconnectedness of social issues.
Sarah
and how
Sultana.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna bring this back to things that I find a little bit more easy to understand, because when I first started talking politics to people who were traditionally on the left of politics, I wanted to know what it was like. Are there a list of things that you can say tick 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 cross tick tick tick, and you've got 8 out of 9 ticks or 7 out of 9 ticks, and you're left enough for us, but it almost feels like sometimes you're never left enough, or you're never right enough. And there's different things that you can do. So, just as an example, where do you stand? Where do you stand on the death penalty?
Okay, death penalty. I'm absolutely against it.
Absolutely against it.
100% fundamentally so. Yeah.
Okay, so me,
Yeah.
I'm absolutely against the death penalty for almost all crimes.
Okay.
But there's a very small, and it's a difficult one to argue against. Like if something is so horrendous, and it occurs, and it's by a repeat offender, who's been through the whole justice system and not, redeemed themselves in their character, and you've tried to rehabilitate them, and they go on and they repeat offence, and it's even worse.
Sure.
There's things like that where I think maybe there's a window, and maybe that you're looking at me disappointed now.
Not disappointed. Quiet. I'm just waiting my time to come in with a retort to it.
Go on. What's your retort?
And what I would say is, I think we need to decide what kind of society it is that we want. Do we want a society which looks at rehabilitation and understanding what makes people do crime?
Yeah.
Or do we simply want an authoritarian and paternalistic approach to it where it's punishment.
And this is my problem with this. Like, you can't ask a question and based on the response of that question, make a view. So I've said what I've said.
Yeah.
And you've said, yeah, but we should rehabilitate them and we should remove all the, remove all the reasons that they might be committing the crime.
Sure.
We should increase their, improve their childhood and give them better out of school. So, all that kind of.
That is where I would stand on this. Yeah. But I mean, if I may, let me put it to a different way. What is your belief of the role of the police, and do you believe police stop crime?
No, of course I don't.
No.
There's a lot we can say about the police, and we've got a show coming up on the police later. But yeah, you're right. I think the police enable an authoritarian state. That's all it is. And if you look at the history of the police, the reason they came about was to protect the assets of the rich from the common folk, you and I. And
Absolutely.
that's what it is.
And so do we want to be having a society where people don't do crime because of the threats of violence that we put on them for doing the crime, or because do we want a society where people understand why crime is wrong and other options to get what they want besides? So
if you frame the question like that, I'm on your side.
Gotcha.
But if you just say death penalty or no death penalty, in the world that we live in, there has to be a reserved number of crimes for a reserved number of people if found guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. Yeah, but absolutely, you try and create an environment where that never happens.
Sure.
I've had a comment from Sadiqa. Sadiqa Ismail, you met on the march in London.
Oh, London, yeah.
Yeah. So she says, hey guys, great show.
Again.
I'm a left converted from the right. However, I am on the right side of the left. But I shift along the spectrum depending on the topic in hand. I think we all do. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to. These labels, would you agree, are determined by self-interest and personal experiences, no matter where you are on the spectrum?
Absolutely, I would. Yeah, and I would say to you, I'm probably a convert from the more right-hand side myself as well.
You're a proper right-winger.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but certainly because, I mean, I worked in sales, I was managing accounts, I worked amongst advertising agencies, and so my interests were very, very different.
Yeah.
I had to fall from grace and realise what it was like to suffer and to lose everything, really, to understand the pain that other people went through without having the same privilege and opportunities as I had had previously. So very much so, yes.
Yeah, definitely your personal experiences. But one thing I don't, and Sadiqa, this is again, it is back to you. Like, one thing I don't get is if you're shifting your view over a period of time because of your experiences, that's one thing. But if you're shifting your view based on your own economic situation, that's like, I don't know, like if I'm second generation immigrant.
Yeah.
I had access to free school meals. I had access to free school uniform. We used to have those vouchers. We used to go out and buy school uniform. Literally, we couldn't afford to buy our own school uniform. We had to. So that's my background. Just because my economic situation, God's blessed me with, a better economic situation than my parents, that shouldn't mean that my values change just because I've got more money in the bank. I shouldn't all of a sudden say, you know what, forget these guys who can't afford healthcare.
Sure.
Forget these guys who can't afford decent schooling. One for me and my family because I've done well. And, so that's the part that I don't. So definitely experiences, but I wouldn't shift because of a change in my economic situation.
No. And that's almost where you kind of get this narrative of people thinking, well, I had to suffer, why don't you? And surely what we should be pushing towards is a society where people that are coming after us had to suffer less than what we did. We all want better for our children, don't we?
Right, exactly, yeah. And if you believe in society in general, and you're part of this society, if you want better for your children, you want better for other people's children.
Absolutely,
right?
And also understand that every child comes into the world with different levels of privilege.
Yes,
and for me, this is really where the left v right argument, or certainly the right side of it, falls apart, where they say that it's down to the parents solely. We can't punish children for their parents' mishaps, can we?
No, absolutely not.
And where does the cost of this pass on to society? If we're saying society doesn't exist, well, if we don't feed a child and if we don't look after it in its younger years, then actually we're probably going to create somebody that has to rely on society for welfare, for mental health help later on down the line, which means the cost for these things for all of us is far greater.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot about, especially again, being a second generation immigrant, there's a lot about integration. Like, the immigrants come over, they don't integrate, they live in their own ghettos and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, true integration is to want for everyone what you want for your kids. That's like really working to try and make everybody's level improve. And that to me is socialism. Yeah,
Sure.
so if you genuinely want integration from ethnic minorities, then you should implement a system of socialism where everybody can contribute and everybody can support everybody else's development. There's some conversations going on here between different members of the audience, so I'm going to let that carry on. Mike's got a question for Sadiqa. Sadiqa, feel free to respond to Mike. But Sadiqa said, in which case, why is it so important to categorize yourself as right or left? Isn't that creating divide? Economic situation should not determine your position. More what the mass of people are suffering is what you fight for. So yeah, I mean, look, left or right, absolutely. I think left versus right does kind of create an us versus them. And I've always said this: we're not supporting football teams.
No, we're not. No, we're not. And it's not meant to be a tribalistic
It's not.
narrative of
Absolutely
left
not.
v right. Let's just get this down. What left and right is, it's an understanding of where these policies lie. Now, a lot of the time we do talk about left v right, and a lot of the time it is primarily about the economy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about taxes, unfiltered capitalism, public ownership versus national ownership. But of course, it does venture into other realms as well, such as the family.
Yeah, family values, conservative family values is what that's the tagline, isn't it?
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And conservative family values would kind of believe that every child should have two parents, that those parents should be one male, one female. And it would fight to keep that as the status quo and the traditionalists. Well, my view is that society moves on. It always has moved on. There is no status quo. Even Socrates argued that everything in the world is fluid and doesn't stay static. And we have to have a responsibility to realise what's happening in society and move policy along with that.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of things that change over time. People's sensibilities, people's views on certain things, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. I'm going to keep going down this list. The left are for higher taxes of the rich,
Yes.
and the right are for lower taxes in general. Looking at that from arm's length, that sounds like the left are quite penal, and the right are quite open to enterprise. How would you respond to that? It's not the position I'm taking. I'm just
No, and I'm going to try and not
positing
take a
response.
left-right position here. I mean, the right's outlook on this is that that corporations should be left to manage themselves.
Which I completely disagree with.
Right.
100%.
I'd disagree with.
As in
as
strongly,
yourself,
strongly, yeah.
Because where does that lead? Now, the left side is that the government needs to step in and put restrictions on the way that corporations do operate within society.
Okay, so here we're talking about regulation, right?
Yep.
Regulation of corporate entities. I'm talking about taxation of individuals. What are your thoughts on that?
The workers should have the lowest tax out of anybody, and the highest earners and corporations should certainly be paying a much bigger share for society. It was written in the Ragged Trousers Philanthropist, actually.
You're going to quote something to me
about
now,
this,
yeah.
about if somebody owns horses, they treat them really, really well. They'll make sure that they're housed, they'll make sure that they're kept warm, they'll make sure that they have clean and dry hay each night, that their shoes are rehooved, and that they have good food each day. The reason for this is because of the vet bills and the cost of replacing a horse.
Yes.
However, a labourer doesn't have these intrinsic attachments to the place where they work. If your employer runs you to the bone and you break your back, I know it sounds a bit extreme, but let's stick with it. You're out of work. That employer has no responsibility to you, and he can replace you just by laying you off and getting somebody else in.
Absolutely.
So
If you're part of the gig economy, and you call in sick because you suffer from the flu 3, 4, 5, months in a row, you've had a couple of days off, then sooner or later they're going to replace you with somebody else, and they're going to stop calling you in.
Sure.
And there's nothing you can do about it. So you're absolutely right. Whereas you're a horse. Will be well fed, will be, looked after, groomed, fed beautifully, housed beautifully, and it'll be almost like a statement of pride.
So there's a certain level of responsibility then put onto the business for what they have done with that resource, isn't there?
Yes.
And in this instance, what we've done is we've changed that resource for a horse for a human being. That cost has to be levied off to society in one way or another. And really the question of taxation is where does that cost really belong?
Yep.
Now, the labourer has gone there to earn a wage. The company is there making a profit and paying out shareholder dividends.
Yes.
For me, some of that needs to go back into the society that they have taken from.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. There's not much to disagree with there. Just going back to the point that you started on, just around regulation.
what was that? Yeah.
Regulation.
Yeah.
So companies, it's basically the companies are responsible for maximizing shareholder value. That's the reason for a company's existence, is to maximize shareholder value. So if anybody sat there thinking we should leave companies to do what they're going to do, and they'll do right by the environment, and they'll do right by the society in general, they'll be socially responsible, that's absolute rubbish. If BP hadn't have blown that underwater well in the Gulf of Mexico back in, what was it, 2006 or something, wasn't it?
They left spitting out into the sea for a long, long time.
They just left it spitting out for weeks. They were
Yeah.
unable to cap it. And for you as an individual to say, oh, do you know what? Well, they did cap it in the end, and they didn't want it to happen, and it cost them lots of money. Well, no, that's the cost of doing business. You absolutely need to have regulations. If you look at Big Pharma, there's been movies on this where Big Pharma have been, trialing medicines on human, basically human subjects in Africa. They've gone off to Africa, and they've been given drugs that are currently under trial. And this is a company that's paying dividends to its very respectable shareholders on Wall Street. So, if anybody tries to argue that companies don't need regulation, let them do what they want and they'll do the right thing and be socially responsible, they're having an absolute laugh.
Oh, gosh, of course they are. And you make a brilliant example with BP, who are probably one of the worst offenders for this sort of crime against
this show
society.
Is not sponsored by BP,
world.
by the way, yeah?
Absolutely, it's not. But there's a company that has known since the 80s what its operations are doing to the environment.
Yes.
Now, you make the point about shareholders, they're there for maximising their profit. Well, unfortunately, there's no profit to be made out of fixing your damage.
None whatsoever.
That's a cost.
Yeah.
And where should that cost be put onto? Again, it comes back to the taxation and what they have taken from a society and what the cost of their operations have been on the societies that they operate within. With BP, Shell and the likes of it, obviously the cost is quite an ultimate one. It is going to be the destruction of the planet and life on Earth.
Yeah, destruction. I mean, and that's the thing, like when you pump stuff out into the environment, no one individually, specifically suffers from that. For example, I live on Outer Road. I'm not going to suffer from the pollution out in the Atlantic Ocean, for example, right? Because it's far enough away from me.
Yeah.
I will indirectly, but I won't see it, not day to day. So it's like, does anybody hold them to account? Well, if it's not governments holding them to account, then they can do that willy-nilly until ultimately all the sea life die and, pretty much all the water's sludgy and it comes up and literally the whole water cycle is impacted. And then I'll see it. But it's way too late then, isn't it? It's way too late.
Oh, God, when we start seeing these big shifts, absolutely. And this is the sad thing about it, is currently we're seeing these damages that corporations are doing and not having to pay for happening in the very, very small degrees.
Okay, I'm going to read a few more comments because we've had loads in. Thank you so much, guys, for joining in. Faisal Mahmood says, not with the recent corporation tax increases. He's obviously a self-employed and looking after his own interests. Tax should be based on assets and savings in the bank, not on income. Faisal, completely agree with you. We spoke about this, Alex.
Yeah.
This is the concept, he's probably adopted this from the concept of zakat in Islam, where you have 2.5% of your assets and your wealth are given in charity where it says taxation, basically. Whereas income, it's like if you're spending your income, and it's the flow of money. Thoughts on that?
Well, no, great point, especially in a time when we're experiencing such high inflation, where actually, if we carry on taxing people that are earning at the current rate and what they are, they're not going to be able to support the economy by buying things and carrying on being consumers in this consumer economy that we've created. And you're quite right. Assets are now going up in price. Their value is increasing, but not by the same rate that people are earning the pound. So now workers, who you've quite rightly said shouldn't be being taxed, are getting pushed into a position where they're never going to be able to own these wealth assets.
Exactly, yeah. So you need to make the ownership of those wealth assets less attractive from a tax point of view.
Yes.
And make them circulate.
Yes.
Yeah. Mike's come back and said the boss of Anglian Water has remuneration package running into millions for being in charge of a very profitable business. Should that not be taxed? I think Mike Faisal's response is going to be, no, it shouldn't. Because either the boss of Anglian Water is then spending those millions in the economy and it's the flow of money, or investing those millions into assets which ultimately do get taxed. So if I'm on £1 million a year and I'm paying zero tax, people might say that's not fair. But either I'm spending $1 million, which means I'm helping all my local economy, I'm creating jobs, and, all these kinds of things, and that there's a flow of money naturally, or I'm spending £100,000 and I'm saving 900,000 by buying property, shares, land, whatever it is, and it's those assets that are taxed.
I'd agree with what you've just said with regards to the assets having to be taxed.
Yeah, the first part you're not so sure about. Yeah. So but I mean, you talked about the velocity of money, didn't you? Do you remember?
Yeah.
So if you're spending it, if you're not taxed, and if you're spending it, isn't it better that you're spending it in your local economy than having it taxed going to the tax man and for them to do what
And
they
this
do?
is why we're better to be taxing the assets rather than the income, because therefore we're leaving more income left to be able to take part in supporting the economy and being spent in communities.
Guys, we're out of time. I just want to very, very quickly read
Wow.
these last couple of messages. Only companies which have religious and moral values will self-regulate, otherwise they won't. From Faisal. Mike saying P&O broke employment law and the CEO told MPs that it was the cost of business. That's to be expected, Mike. And Mike saying, she's probably banking in the Cayman Islands. Okay, so absolutely asset flight. We need to do a show on that. When people take assets and register them in a tax haven so as to not pay tax, absolutely.
Which just removes the economy
abhorrent.
from a finite system.
Exactly. Abhorrent practice. Thank you so much to
Thanks
all
for
of our
listening.
contributors. Thank you so much for listening. Alex, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Imtiaz.
We will be back again next week. We're going to be talking, I think we're talking nationalisation, but either way, it's going to be a riveting conversation. Please join us again then. Assalamu alaikum.